was the kind of day that called for fanfare. The harbor of Stockholm bustled with excitement as flags rippled in the summer wind and citizens gathered along the quays. On the calm waters of the Baltic Sea, a wooden giant floated proudly, dark hull polished to a mirror shine, rows of bronze cannons gleaming, and hundreds of intricate carvings painted in rich, royal colors. This was the Vasa, Sweden's most magnificent warship, a floating monument to the ambitions of King Gustavus Adolphus. After years of construction, delays, redesigns, and royal demands, the Vasa was finally ready to sail. Or so everyone believed. Drums rolled, the ship's captain gave the signal, and with a snap of white sails, the Vasa began her maiden voyage. Cannons boomed a salute, civilians waved, nobles aboard the ship sipped one wine and admired the view. Then, mere minutes into the journey, just 1,300 meters from the dock, a sudden gust of wind caught her sails. The Vasa heeled sharply to port, righted herself, then tilted again, this time more dangerously. In the space of a heartbeat, the sea rushed through open gun ports. She began to sink. From ashore, it was a surreal sight, a majestic warship listing, water devouring her fine ornamentation. Crew members leapt into the water, clinging to debris. Noble passengers scrambled. The harbor, moments ago filled with cheers, echoed with gasps and silence. And then, the unthinkable happened. The Vasa disappeared beneath the waves. In less than 20 minutes, Sweden's pride was at the bottom of the sea. But let's rewind just a little, because the Vasa wasn't just a ship. She was a product of pressure, royal, political, and personal. In the early 1620s, Europe simmered in the flames of the 30 Years' War. Gustavus Adolphus, the warrior king, wanted to project Sweden as a rising naval power. The navy needed symbols, floating fortresses that could dominate the Baltic and intimidate rivals. Vasa was intended as just that. She was designed to carry 64 heavy bronze cannons and 300 soldiers. She would be taller than any ship Sweden had built, more richly decorated than any war vessel before her. But as you'll soon learn, pride doesn't float. The construction was ambitious from the start. Built at the Royal Shipyard on the island of Skeppsholmen under master shipwright Henrik Hybertsson, the Vasa stretched nearly 70 meters long with 2 full gun decks, unusual and highly risky at the time. The upper works, those elaborate carvings of lions, angels, kings, and biblical scenes, added enormous top weight. And with little formal knowledge of center of gravity physics, the builders trusted a few sandbag tilt tests to assess balance. They failed those tests. But the ship still sailed, because failure wasn't an option, not politically. King Gustavus was at war. He demanded firepower now. He dictated cannon arrangements by letter. He ordered the ship launched with all haste, even before proper stability trials could be completed. When builders expressed concerns, they were dismissed. When trial runs showed excessive swaying, officials shrugged. The ship was painted, polished, armed, and launched. The maiden voyage was intended to be a show of force, an opening act to a military campaign, a parade of engineering. Instead, it became a tragedy. 30 lives were lost when the ship went down, and worse, Sweden's enemies laughed. Diplomats from Poland and Denmark, watching from afar, called it a floating folly. Back in Stockholm, a royal inquiry tried to find someone to blame. Captain Sofring Hansen was interrogated. Shipbuilders were questioned. But ultimately, no one was punished. How could they be? The ship sank because it obeyed orders. The design flaw had a name, and it was politics. And then, just like that, the Vasa vanished into silence. It would remain there for more than 3 centuries, preserved in the cold, brackish waters of the Baltic. But this is only the beginning of her story, because the Vasa would one day return, resurrected not by royal decree, but by the sheer stubbornness of a man who refused to stop searching. The Vasa had all the trappings of greatness, towering masts, 2 full gun decks, and the kind of intricate sculptures you'd expect on a cathedral, not a battleship. It was a floating fortress wrapped in royal arrogance. But beneath the ornate carvings and gilded figures lay a secret flaw, one that would drag her into the Baltic just minutes after launch. To understand how this happened, let's descend below deck, literally and figuratively. At the time, the science of naval architecture was still as much art as guesswork. Sweden had never built a warship of this scale. The Vasa was designed to carry 64 bronze cannons, mostly the heavy 24-pounders. Massive weapons meant to deliver destruction across the waves. But bronze is dense and heavy. Stack those on 2 full gun decks, add layers of thick oak, soldiers, supplies, masts, sails, and then top it all off with dozens of towering wooden statues. And you've got a problem, specifically an unstable center of gravity. Now, the shipwrights weren't completely blind. They did perform a stability test, what today we'd call a roll test. 30 men ran side to side on the deck to simulate wave action. After just 3 runs, the ship swayed so much the test was stopped, for fear the Vasa would capsize right there at the dock. The ship clearly had issues, but no one wanted to halt the project. Not with King Gustavus Adolphus breathing down their necks from the front lines. The king's letters show impatience. He demanded progress, He even ordered more cannons be placed on the upper deck, further raising the center of mass. Political pressure combined with national pride drowned out the whispers of concern. The builders complied, the Navy officers obeyed, and the Vasa, increasingly top-heavy, was dressed for parade, but not for battle. Let's talk more about those carvings. There were over 500 wooden sculptures adorning the ship. Mythological beasts, Roman emperors, lions, mermaids, angels, and Swedish royalty. Most were painted in vibrant hues and gilded with gold leaf. These weren't just decorative, they were propaganda. They told a story, Sweden's divine right, the king's strength, the enemy's weakness. And yet, every single carving added weight above deck. Lots of it. This wasn't just a warship. It was a floating billboard, a political weapon as much as a naval one. And therein lay the flaw. The Vasa wasn't designed solely for function. She was designed to impress. And while Swedish craftsmen were world-class, the ship's dimensions had shifted mid-build. Originally planned as a smaller ship, the Vasa was expanded mid-construction to accommodate more firepower. But the hull was never properly redesigned to compensate. Imagine building a second floor onto your house by just stacking it on the roof without widening the foundation. That's basically what happened here. Moreover, the hull's width to height ratio was too narrow. The Vasa stood tall and proud, but her base was slender, like trying to stand a bowling pin upright in a breeze. Add the lack of ballast, rocks, and weights in the hold to stabilize the ship, and it's no wonder she couldn't handle a gust of wind. And here's a twist. The ballast was there, but it wasn't enough. She carried 120 tons of stone ballast, but she needed far more to offset the top weight. Adding more ballast would have sunk her lower in the water, dangerous for the lower gun ports. So again, politics won over physics. The gun ports stayed, the ballast was capped, and the ship was declared seaworthy. In a royal inquiry after the sinking, the builders were asked, why did the ship capsize? Their answer, she was unstable. Simple, honest. But the committee, unwilling to accuse the king or themselves, concluded that no one was to blame. It was just fate, they said. Maybe a gust too strong. Maybe God's will. Anything but human error. But history is less forgiving. Today, we know exactly what doomed the Vasa. She was a victim of ambition without accountability, aesthetics over engineering, and pressure without prudence. The Vasa's real enemies weren't Danish or Polish fleets. They were misplaced priorities and a refusal to listen. Yet even in failure, the ship left behind a legacy, a lesson carved in oak and sunk in pride. And that pride, ironically, helped preserve her, because the cold, low-salt waters of the Baltic kept her safe for over 300 years. No shipworms, no rot, just silence. Waiting. When the Vasa disappeared beneath the waters of Stockholm harbor, the shock rippled far beyond the shoreline. What was supposed to be a triumphant launch, a floating show of power, had collapsed into an absurd and very public failure. No enemy fire, no storm, no battle, just a breeze and bad decisions. And yet, despite its brevity, the ship's maiden voyage would leave a deep mark on Sweden's royal image. The next morning, rumors flooded the capital faster than the ship had sunk. Eyewitnesses whispered of water pouring into open gun ports, of crewmen clamoring for their lives, of nobles soaked and humiliated. The king was not present at the launch, but the news reached him quickly. His brand new warship, his symbol of dominance, had vanished less than a mile from where it was built. The embarrassment was instant and enormous. But Gustavus Adolphus was not a king known for self-doubt. He was at the front lines of the 30 Years' War, expanding Swedish influence across Northern Europe. He needed this ship, and he needed someone to blame. So within days, a royal commission was formed to investigate the disaster. Witnesses were called, tests reviewed, records scoured. One by one, shipbuilders, officers, and naval administrators were summoned, not to seek justice necessarily, but to manage public perception. Yet what emerged from the inquiry was less a revelation than a confirmation. Everyone had known the ship was unstable. The builders had warned of it. The captain had observed it. Even the king had been indirectly informed. But no one had stopped the launch. No one had dared, because to delay the Vasa would be to disappoint the king. And in a 17th century monarchy, disappointing the king could mean exile, disgrace, or worse. And so, in the face of overwhelming evidence, the commission came to a curious conclusion. No one was to blame. The sinking was deemed an act of God. Convenient, perhaps, but also telling. The culture of fear and flattery around the throne had produced a ship that couldn't sail, and no one had dared say so. Meanwhile, divers were sent to the wreck, not to raise it, but to retrieve the valuable cannons. Using primitive diving bells, wooden barrels weighted with stones and pumped with air, salvors descended into the cold, murky depths. Over the next few years, they recovered many of the bronze guns, along with some items from the decks. But the wreck itself was left untouched, slowly disappearing from public memory. Stockholm moved on. The Vasa faded into obscurity. Still, the incident left a shadow over Swedish naval design. Lessons were quietly learned. Future ships were built with more caution, more testing, and eventually more understanding of physics. The Vasa became a cautionary tale told in shipyards, a name mentioned in hushed tones rather than celebrated in ballads. Ironically, her fate may have spared other ships. The failure was so spectacular that it forced a reevaluation of Swedish naval priorities. Better that one ship sink in peacetime, some said, than a whole fleet in war. But for all the practical adjustments, the cultural wound remained. Vasa had been meant to intimidate enemies and inspire allies. Instead, she became a floating punchline. Foreign diplomats mocked Sweden's naval ambitions. In Poland, the king reportedly chuckled at Sweden's misfortune. In Denmark, satirists composed verses. It was more than just a shipwreck. It was a national embarrassment on display for the world. And yet, beneath the waves the Vasa endured. Time passed, empires shifted, Stockholm grew and modernized. The harbor silted. The war she was meant to fight moved into the realm of books and dusty archives. And while the world forgot, the ship remained, quiet, still, preserved in the cool, low-oxygen waters of the Baltic, like a slumbering ghost waiting. The irony is hard to ignore. What was once a source of shame would, centuries later, become a point of pride. The very thing that humiliated a nation would one day become its most visited treasure. But we're not quite there yet. First, someone had to care enough to look. And as it turns out, someone did. But not a king, not a Navy admiral, not a general, just a guy who loved ships and who refused to stop searching. The Baltic Sea is not known for forgiveness. Its waters are cold, dark, and brackish, somewhere between fresh and salty. For most ships, that would mean slow dissolution. Wood rots, worms feast, waves erase. But the Vasa had luck in her failure. The same sea that swallowed her also preserved her. In fact, it may have been the perfect tomb. After the failed salvage operations of the 17th century, the Vasa was left alone. She wasn't forgotten completely. Her sinking was still part of naval lore, a footnote in royal biographies. But she drifted further from collective memory as decades turned into centuries. Stockholm evolved, expanded, modernized. Harbors were deepened, canals widened. Yet below the waves, barely 30 meters beneath the surface, the Vasa lay untouched, shielded by layers of silt and the blessing of science, the Baltic's unique chemistry. Unlike warmer seas, the Baltic lacks teredo navalis, the notorious shipworm that eats wooden wrecks. The cold, low-oxygen water limited microbial decay. As a result, Vasa's oak hull, carvings, and even textiles remained astonishingly intact. Cannonballs sat quietly in their racks. Shoes lay abandoned on planks. And the ship, which never made it past the harbor mouth, waited for someone to care enough to find her. For centuries, that someone didn't come. Naval priorities moved on. Steam replaced sail, iron replaced wood. But in the early 20th century, whispers began. Amateur historians speculated that the Vasa might still exist. Some believed she had been broken apart. Others thought she had rotted into sludge. Still, the idea persisted, like a maritime myth just begging to be proven. Enter Anders Franzen, a naval engineer and oil researcher with a passion for shipwrecks and a stubborn streak as thick as Baltic ice. In the 1950s, Franzen became obsessed with the Vasa. He read every record he could find, traced old maps, studied currents, interviewed harbor workers. He believed, not just vaguely but precisely, that the ship was still there, nearly whole, lying beneath layers of mud. He wasn't the first to try, but he was certainly the most relentless. Over several summers, Franzen and a small team dragged a homemade core sampler across Stockholm harbor. It was a tedious process, involving pulling up bits of wood and mud through tubes to check for old timber. For years, they found nothing useful, just debris, fragments, disappointment. Then, in August 1956, something changed. The core sample came up with blackened oak, clearly handworked and not modern. It was something. Then more. Bits of carved wood, iron nails, a piece of gun port framing. They were on the right track. Next came the divers. Using early scuba gear, they explored the seafloor around the area Franzen had marked. Visibility was poor. The water was freezing. But on September 25, 1956, diver Per Edvin Felting descended and found a curved wooden structure buried in the silt. It was unmistakable. The side of a ship, complete with cannon ports. The Vasa had been found. What followed was a slow-burning explosion of excitement. The Swedish Navy got involved. Government agencies pledged support. Engineers studied ways to raise the wreck. And as the surveys continued, the reports grew more incredible. The Vasa was almost fully intact. Her hull, her masts, her carvings, even bones from the sailors who went down with her. But raising a 17th century warship from the seabed was no small task. The ship was fragile, the mud was thick, and the risk of breakage or collapse was very real. But Franzen pushed forward. He knew what the Vasa meant, not just as a relic, but as a resurrection. This was a piece of living history, trapped in stillness for over 300 years. And so with cranes, pontoons, cables, and the most careful choreography ever attempted underwater, the plan to bring her up began. It would take years, and the world would watch. But even before she surfaced, Vasa had already risen. If not in body, then in spirit. She was no longer a forgotten embarrassment. She was now a national obsession, a media story, a symbol of patience and persistence. The ghost ship was about to breathe again. At the center of the Vasa's return to the world was not a king, a navy, or a grand institution, but one man with an obsession, a bookshelf full of warship plans, and a firm belief that Swedish maritime history still had something breathtaking to offer. His name was Anders Franzen, and if the Vasa was a ship of stubborn ambition, Franzen was its modern-day match. Franzen wasn't a diver or an archaeologist. He was an oil engineer by trade, a naval history nerd by passion, and, most importantly, a man who didn't like letting things go. His journey began not with sonar or satellites, but with stacks of old shipyard records and harbor charts. The Vasa had gone down in 1628, yes, but Franzen believed she hadn't gone far. The Baltic, with its near-magical ability to preserve shipwrecks, offered a real chance that the Vasa had survived. But believing and proving are different things. In the early 1950s, Franzen launched a quiet, lonely crusade. Using his own funds and borrowed time, he painstakingly dragged a homemade core sampler across the silty floor of Stockholm harbor. It was an absurdly analog process. Lower a tube, pull up a plug of seabed, examine it for wood. He did this hundreds of times. Most people would have given up. Franzen didn't. His friends called him obsessed. Harbor authorities gave him polite nods. Historians raised their eyebrows. But Franzen kept going. His apartment was full of labeled jars of mud. He wrote articles, gave talks, begged for equipment. Most of all, he kept returning to the same idea. The Vasa had not vanished, just slipped below the surface of attention. And then came the breakthrough. In August 1956, a core sample pulled from near Beckholmen Island revealed something unique. Hand-cut oak, coated in centuries of black sediment. Excitement surged. With help from amateur divers, including a young naval officer named Per Edvin Felting, Franzen mounted a physical search. On September 25, 1956, in the murky, frigid water, Felting descended and saw it, a carved gun port buried in mud but unmistakably intact. He surfaced, eyes wide, and told Franzen, "We found her." It was real. All the charts, theories, and core samples had paid off. The next step was audacious. Raise her. Sweden rallied. The Navy and civil engineers convened. Salvage experts outlined options. The challenge was enormous. The Vasa was delicate, like a soaked cardboard box that had somehow kept its shape. Digging around her would cause collapse. Lifting her directly would snap timbers. But Franzen, ever persuasive, convinced officials to try something bold. Dig 6 tunnels beneath the ship, thread steel cables through them, attach pontoons, and lift her like a cradle. The plan took years. Divers worked in nearly zero visibility, sometimes with bare hands. A special cofferdam was built to prevent sediment shift. Pumps hummed. Calculations were adjusted daily. It was, as one worker said, like lifting a ghost from glue. Then, on April 24, 1961, history changed. In front of reporters, cameras, and a nation holding its breath, the Vasa breached the surface for the first time in 333 years. Masts emerged. Decks followed. Ornate carvings glistened through layers of mud. It was surreal, a full-blown time capsule rising from the deep, defiantly intact. Cheers erupted. Journalists called it the resurrection of a national treasure. Franzen, watching from a nearby boat, reportedly wept. And just like that, the Vasa became more than a shipwreck. It became a triumph of maritime history, perseverance, and personal obsession. But raising her was just the beginning. Her wood was saturated with water. Without treatment, she would crumble. So began a decades-long conservation effort, spraying the entire ship with polyethylene glycol to stabilize the timber. Every beam, carving, and cannon was documented. Thousands of artifacts, shoes, coins, tools, even a backgammon board, were recovered, cleaned, and studied. Franzen didn't live to see every phase completed. He passed away in 1993. But his legacy is sealed into every inch of the Vasa Museum that stands today. A man armed only with curiosity and grit had brought a forgotten masterpiece back to life. No grant, no government order, just passion and refusal to quit. Because sometimes that's all history needs. One person who cares enough to dig. The morning light shimmered across Stockholm's harbor as the Vasa, held delicately in the steel sling of pontoons and cables, broke the surface for the first time since 1628. Mud slid down her timbers like tears. Water drained from her cannon ports. And for a long moment, silence reigned. Onlookers stood breathless. It was not just the return of a ship, it was the resurrection of a lost chapter in maritime history. The recovery of the Vasa had never been guaranteed. In fact, most salvage experts initially thought the project was doomed to failure. They feared the wood would disintegrate on contact with air. They worried about structural collapse. But the ship emerged from the sea with her sides mostly intact, her bow upright, and her soul, if ships have souls, entirely untouched. The world was watching, and Sweden was suddenly the steward of a 17th century miracle. Once she was out of the water, the real challenge began. The Vasa had to be preserved, and quickly. The timbers were waterlogged, soft, and full of silt. If allowed to dry naturally, they would crack, shrink, and fall apart. Scientists scrambled to act. They built a special shelter around the ship. Then, using an enormous system of nozzles and pumps, they sprayed the hull continuously with polyethylene glycol, PG, a water-soluble wax that would slowly replace the moisture in the wood and stabilize it. This preservation process took 17 years. Yes, 17. Day after day, year after year, technicians and historians worked to keep the ship from turning to dust. And while they did, they unearthed thousands of secrets. Over 26,000 artifacts were recovered from the wreck. Everything from boots to combs to full meals still in ceramic bowls. Historians found playing cards, weapons, coins, even tools still lying in place as if waiting to be picked up. Human remains were also discovered. Men and women who went down with the ship, their bones telling stories of broken legs and desperate moments. One sailor was found near a pump with a tool in his hand. Perhaps he had been trying to fix the flooding. Another was discovered with a pouch of coins, tightly clutched, maybe in hope, maybe in fear. The lives that had been lost were no longer statistics. They were people, frozen in time. The carvings that once served as royal propaganda were cataloged, cleaned, and reinterpreted. Lions, Roman emperors, Greek gods, and devils emerged from beneath the muck. The level of craftsmanship stunned art historians. Some carvings still bore traces of original paint, vivid blues, reds, and golds that had not seen daylight in centuries. By the 1980s, the ship was stable enough to be moved to a permanent home. The Vasa Museum, Vasa Museet, was constructed on Djurgården Island in Stockholm, a building designed to house the ship like a cathedral does a saint. And rightly so. The Vasa had gone from military flop to cultural icon. She became the most visited museum attraction in Scandinavia. Visitors walk into the main hall and are struck dumb. The ship looms above you, her sides towering like walls from a medieval castle. She is not a replica, not a reconstruction. She is the real thing. And somehow she still breathes with presence. For Swedes, the Vasa is no longer a symbol of embarrassment, but of endurance. She is proof that even our greatest failures can be redeemed. For historians, she is a time capsule, offering unparalleled insights into 17th century life, politics, warfare, and shipbuilding. For tourists, she is a marvel, and for storytellers, she is a gift that keeps on giving. Her recovery changed the way the world thinks about underwater archaeology. It proved that even delicate wrecks can be lifted and studied with care. It set the gold standard for conservation and inspired generations of maritime historians. The story of the Vasa is no longer one of loss, but of patience, passion, and rediscovery. And the cold waters of the Baltic, once her grave, are now part of her legend. Step into the Vasa Museum, and the first thing that greets you is silence. Not the hush of a bored crowd, but a reverent quiet, like entering a cathedral. Before you towers the Vasa herself, 69 meters of carved oak, her hull rising nearly 7 stories high, her blackened timbers illuminated with soft amber light. She's not behind glass, she's not roped off. She stands alone in the center of the museum, held not just by engineering but by the collective awe of every person who enters. This is maritime history you can walk around, touch with your eyes, and feel in your chest. Opened officially in 1990, the Vasa Museum, Vasa Museet, quickly became Sweden's most visited attraction, welcoming over 1 million guests per year. And yet, despite the crowds, the space never feels hurried. Designed with reverence and care, the building wraps around the ship like a protective cocoon. Ramps spiral along the hull, offering visitors views from every level. Gun deck, crow's nest, bow and stern. There is no bad angle. Every plank has a story. Look closely and you'll see the scars. Wood darkened by centuries underwater. Reconstructed carvings where original pieces couldn't be saved. Gaps where lives were lost. It's not a cleaned-up Disneyland version of the past. It's honest, raw, and completely real. The museum does more than just display the ship. It tells the stories behind her. Galleries showcase artifacts recovered from the wreck. Boots made of stiffened leather. Finely carved dice. Sailors' rations. Even a tankard still marked with the initials of its owner. There's a skeleton of a man found with broken limbs, possibly crushed during the ship's tilt. Each object deepens the narrative, proof that the people aboard the Vasa were not just historical footnotes. but human beings with daily routines, favorite meals, and hopes they carried on board that August day in 1628. The museum also explains the science behind the resurrection. Diagrams and films demonstrate the preservation process, the engineering feats, and the long struggle to keep the Vasa intact. Interactive exhibits let kids touch timber samples or simulate lifting a ship from silt. It's not just a place to look, it's a place to understand. And what a strange story to understand. A ship built to project power that never made it beyond the city walls. A warship that never fought. A royal embarrassment turned national treasure. Few countries would have had the humility to embrace such a failure. Fewer still would turn it into a monument. But Sweden did. The Vasa's journey from tragedy to triumph says something rare about how we engage with our past. It's not always about celebrating victory. Sometimes it's about honoring the humanity of mistakes, about recognizing that ambition and error often walk hand in hand, that even in collapse there can be dignity, even in failure, beauty. And perhaps that's why the Vasa resonates with so many. She is not merely a ship, she is a parable, a sculpture in wood, brass, and consequence. And she survives more than any victorious vessel of her time. Not because she was flawless, but because she was saved, cared for, and believed in. Stand before her long enough and you start to notice odd things. How her carved angels seem to watch you. How the low light makes her shimmer like she's still underwater. How the air inside the museum is thick with quiet. You don't just visit the Vasa, you witness her. This ship that never completed a journey now invites millions into hers. The visitors come from around the world, some with curiosity, some with reverence, others with school groups or cameras or tired children in tow. But nearly all leave with the same expression, wide-eyed, hushed, moved. Because in this vessel, this time capsule, this cathedral of ambition, you feel it. The gravity of dreams, the weight of the sea, the patience of those who refuse to let her stay buried, and the truth that maritime history isn't just about battles and conquests. Sometimes it's about what we recover and what we choose to remember. And so the Vasa rests, not at the bottom of the Baltic, but beneath soft museum lights, surrounded by voices in dozens of languages, the quiet hum of footsteps, and the breathless awe of discovery. She is no longer just a relic nor a failure frozen in time. She is a survivor, reborn through curiosity and care. There's something deeply comforting about that. The idea that a mistake, once ridiculed and buried, can, with time, become a treasure. That what's broken can still teach. That what sinks can rise again. The Vasa reminds us that even in the cold silence of the deep, stories wait to be retold. And when they are, they change how we see the past and ourselves. As you step away from the hull, past the ancient wood and worn-out shoes, you may find yourself a little quieter too. Not from sadness, but from the kind of reverence that only maritime history can summon. Because this wasn't just a ship, it was a dream. And even sunken dreams, it turns out, can be brought back to life. Thanks for staying with me until the end of this journey. If you enjoyed today's video, I hope you'll join me next time, when we uncover another legend that time tried to forget. There's always another ship, another story, another ghost waiting to be heard.